Assalamu alaikum. This is Brother Hameed back again with the Muslim Empowerment Institute. You know, one of the major issues affecting black American Muslims is this paralysis of analysis, this notion of what we call theoretical Islam. Now, first, what do we mean by theoretical Islam? We see that many of us are very attentive to the many nuances in Islam, or a better way, as I like to put it, we're unable to see the forest for the trees and we're just stuck there. We have a sincere attachment to the parts, but not the whole. Black American Muslims have been practicing a very compartmentalized Islam where we're focused on learning the different Islamic lingo, learning the different sunnahs of our clothing or of the beard, or making sure your pants are above your ankles, or making sure you wash the appropriate limbs when you make wudu, or learning the different du'as for entering the bathroom or what have you. And you know, for many of us, our Islam is only surface level, very ritualistic and dogmatic. And seemingly, this is all we think Islam is about. And this is all we've been passing on to our children. Just rituals devoid of any meaning that we care to learn. We passed on the traces of Islam, but not Islam itself. Now, I'm not saying that some of these things are not important, but when you overemphasize everything that's outward, you're going to neglect the inward. We wear Islam on our sleeve, and that's it. Now, to get into the crux of this, we're going to talk about this whole Aqidah obsession that many of us have. And I'll get into the reasons later. It's apparent that many of us differ regarding the matters of Iman or faith, or what is commonly referred to as Aqidah or creed. Now, this term Aqidah is a term that the Prophet never used. And he never went around saying you must believe in these 105 tenets of doctrine in order to be a Muslim. He didn't do that. And as a matter of fact, these books of Aqidah, such as the more popular ones like Aqidah Tahawi or Aqidah al-Wasatiyah, these books didn't come about until a few hundred years after the death of the Prophet. And they came about as a result of the different ideologies that were around during that time. Those scholars wanted to lay down a specific Islamic creed in order to classify those that disagreed as deviants, and this is due to the political climate of the time. So let me ask you this, without these Aqidah books, how did the Prophet's companions survive? How were they Muslim without the Aqidah books? Well, they had the Quran, they had Iman in Allah, the messengers, the books, the angels, the Day of Judgment, and the Qadr, and they had the Sunnah, the living example of how the Prophet practiced and taught the deen of Islam. They had no written down hadith, which of course is a documentation of the sunnah from a human being who could have gotten it right and he could have gotten it wrong too. And not to get off the topic, but we know that not every hadith is necessarily found in the sunnah, and not every sunnah was necessarily documented as a hadith. Now, when we talk about which scholar was correct or who had the proper Aqidah or who had the correct methodology for practicing Islam or what have you, well, it really depended on which scholar had the backing of whoever was ruling the Islamic State and who essentially had the biggest sword. And that's really it. You know, some of us may think that a particular ideology was correct because it was the most widespread and the most dominant, according to what someone from overseas told us, but that's not the case. Now, I'm going to go into a little of these nuances of Aqidah very succinctly, something that I haven't heard too many people before without a bias expound upon in details before publicly. First, you have what is deemed Salafi Aqidah, which is a literal understanding of creed for the most part. According to Salafis, Allah has a face, two hands, and both of them are right, two eyes, a foot, and a shin. And they say on the last third of the night, Allah descends down to the lowest heaven to see if someone is up making dua, and they say that Allah is above the throne. They even say if a man's pants leg goes past his ankle, then that part below the ankles will be in the hellfire. You know, when actually the hadith is referring to those who display arrogance. And inshallah, maybe in another video, we'll talk about how, you know, we misunderstand things. Now, there's some other things, but this is just the gist of it. Now, they would say that despite the obvious anthropomorphic terminology, that these supposed attributes are without tashbih, meaning without any likeness to the creation. Now, I would ask them, is there a rule that everything in the Quran has to be taken literally? Is there some actual ruling that says this. The Arabs during the Prophet's time were into poetry. The Quran was and is a miracle that outdid the poetry of its time. And of course, the Quran is not poetry, but it has literary devices similar to poetry. The Quran has similes, metaphors, rhyme, and it has a certain rhythm to it. Could it be that since the Quran is the speech of Allah, or the Quran is an expression of Allah's speech in a created language, if you will, could it be that Allah is speaking to us in an intimate manner in a way that we can understand Him? Could that be? Could it be that if we take everything in the Quran by its face value, then it could potentially lead to contradictions? You know, one thing I always thought is, how does Allah Himself come down to the lowest heaven at the last third of the night, when the last third of the night differs depending on what side of the world you're on? Then He could never be above His throne, because He would be constantly going up and down, depending on what side of the world you're on. It doesn't add up. Something's wrong here. And then you have what is deemed Ashari or Maturidi Aqidah, which is mentioned before, came about due to certain influences of the time about 200 or 300 years after the Prophet's time. Now during that time and in that particular region where the Ashari or Maturidi Aqidah emerged, and people use Ashari and Maturidi interchangeably because essentially they said the same thing, but they were in surrounding regions. People that during that time were into Greek philosophy, and the Muslims started to read those books, and they adopted a lot of the language and a lot of the concepts of the Aristotelian philosophers. And if you study Greek philosophy like I have, you'll see that there are some stark similarities to what the early Asharis were talking about. You can barely tell the difference, to be honest. Now later it's said that some aspects of the Ashari Aqidah were updated to be more Quran and Sunnah based, but Allah knows best. Now to go into some of these details, the Asharis wouldn't say that Allah has a literal hand or face or any of that. They would interpret things metaphorically. They would say Allah's hand is His power, or His face is His dominion. Another thing they would say is that Allah is not in a place, He's not in the 6 directions. The directions meaning front, back, up, down, right, left. And many of them would say that believing that Allah is in a place implies that you believe Allah is a body and that He is inside of His creation. And many of them even said that if you believe Allah is a body, then you must believe Allah is in a place and Allah created places, and then that renders you a non-believer if you believe that. Now I would ask, did Allah say any of this? Is it explicitly mentioned in the Quran that Allah is not a body and that He's not in the 6 directions? How can it be kufr or disbelief to believe in such when Allah and His Messenger didn't go into any of that? How could it be? Oh well, the scholars that lived 1,000 years ago in such and such place unanimously agreed, as if that really matters today. How can something that's not in the Quran be an essential of Islamic belief to the point where if you say someone disagrees with your Imam, then that renders you a kafir? How could it be? Especially since the belief that's asserted to be an Islamic belief came from the Greek philosophers. How is that? And Muslims may differ in matters of Islam, particularly the various schools of thought and the varying opinions of jurisprudence, and we make the differences from amongst the mujtahid imams something more major than it really has to be. When history tells us that Prophet Muhammad and several of his main companions were around him, but they didn't observe everything that he did, and different companions saw him do different stuff, and they made rulings based on what they saw the Prophet do, and then they dispersed and taught their students their rulings, and thus the different opinions came about. And later the madhabs were formulated based on these differences of opinion, which became regional differences. We do it like this in Egypt, and they do it like this in Senegal, and so on and so forth. So a lot of us in today's time, we follow the differences in the 4 imams as if these are our actual differences. And then we use these as weapons to fight with people. Something that hasn't been worked out in 1400 years is definitely not going to be worked out in today's time. So we spend a lifetime meticulously analyzing this stuff to the point where we can never reach spirituality, or ihsan, which the Prophet mentioned was to worship Allah as if you see Him. We're just stuck in this theory and this theoretical stuff. This theoretical Islam that we've been practicing has kept us on the back of the camel. And many of us believe arrogantly that only our singular and very limited understanding of Islam is the only proper interpretation of the deen. You got different groups of black Salafis, different groups of black Sufis, and all this stuff. And we're seemingly unable or unwilling to put down our labels for the sake and survival of Islam within the black American community. We're completely unwilling. Many of us are. And it's all a sign of our lack of knowledge and our religious immaturity. Everyone is graduating except us. We're still stuck in high school and unable to graduate while we're watching every other ethnicity of Muslims succeed past us. You know, Sheikh Yasser Qadi, who was a contemporary Islamic scholar, he mentioned that when people in his parents' generation came to America, it was all types of immigrant Muslims from all over the Muslim world, and they would come to a particular city, and they all worked together to start a masjid and community. They had Shia, they had Ikhwan al-Muslimin, they had Sufis, they had every understanding of Islam all in one masjid, and they were able to work together. And when they began to grow and expand, then they decided to part ways. Now you look at the situation with black American Muslims, maybe a place in the Northeast. You'll have countless different understandings of the deen, and everybody's black and from the same country, but no one can seem to work together. Meanwhile, post-1975, those of us who identify with all these overseas extensions of Islam were unable to take a page out of the immigrant model, which can actually work for us, and just work together. We don't want to focus on that which unites us and ignore that which divides us, yet we rather focus on that which divides us and ignore that which unites us. My understanding is the best understanding, and everyone else is wrong. You got folks who've been saying this stuff for 20 years or longer on the same confusion. Brother, I'm not working with them because they ain't got the proper aqidah. Meanwhile, your imam is in a third world country and he can't even speak your language, and he's never been to America, and he ain't coming to see about you. This Toby Muhammad phenomenon is real. The immigrant Muslim community has made a lot of steps to establish scholarship in America. What about us? Many of our black American Muslim scholars are still teaching out of the 1,000-year-old books that were written before there was ever such thing as a black American. What type of scholarship have they produced to educate black American Muslims on how we can use Islam as a tool of empowerment to rid us of our ills as black folks in America? But those brothers and sisters don't have time for that. That would interfere with their main focus, which is to prepare the second-generation immigrant Muslim community to be the religious authorities of Islam in America for the future. Because quite frankly, brothers and sisters, reviving Islam within the black American community ain't paying the bills of the black American Muslim scholarship. So in closing, let us realize they didn't have Aqidah during the Prophet's time. They had Iman. Iman is the actual beliefs, and Aqidah is the breakdown of the beliefs with extraneous scholarly details that the Prophet never expounded upon, with details that may differ depending on who you ask. You know, it's always us, the blacks, who trying to foster a theology-based identity. And why? Because we don't have knowledge of self. That's the reason. We got to stop living out the problems that occurred 1,000 years ago, because we got enough problems on our own to contend with. We got Muslims with mental illness around who don't take their meds and are attracted to whacked out extreme interpretations of the deen as a result of their mental illness. And practicing the foolishness only makes them more mentally ill. We got the toxic masculinity folks out there who are writing feminist tafsirs of the Quran, partially because our scholars of today won't produce a tafsir of the Quran for contemporary times. We got Muslims who have reduced the deen of Islam to nothing but a politicized identity devoid of any substance, and engage in identity politics as their only motivation for being Muslim. We got Muslims out there who want to intersect everything and everybody with Islam, knowing that Islam don't mix with everything. Meanwhile, we're talking all this theoretical stuff, and the whole world is burning down around you while you're arguing with folks about whether Allah has a hand or not. It's time out for theorizing and learning and more learning. Now's the time for application. It's been time for application. But under our Sunni understanding, with all this proper aqidah that we've had a difficult time appropriating the Quran and Sunnah in a way that transforms our people in America. And I would say that the main reason is due to our blind attachment to theoretical Islam. And for the sake and survival of Islam within the Black American community, we must put away this theoretical stuff and just be Muslims without all the man-made labels, and work to purify ourselves and teach our families that which is correct, and be good citizens and advocate for our community. This is what Islam teaches us. Brothers and sisters, let us work together and not apart. Let us put away our own selfish agendas. And if you have this brother over here doing the same thing and another brother doing the same thing over there, why not do the same thing together? You'll be more successful that way, and you'll attain the blessing from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. As the Prophet mentioned, cling to the jama'ah, the congregation, for verily the wolf devours a lonely sheep. Please like and subscribe and share this video to your networks. Check out MuslimEmpowermentInstitute.org for articles and publications. And keep on the lookout for the Global State of Islam in Black America tour with the founder of the Muslim Empowerment Institute and Islam in America movement, Brother Imam Amin Nathari. Inshallah, he'll be in DC, Philly, Chicago, Memphis, and a host of other cities with the State of Islam in Black America book tour. And check out our brother Hakeem Muhammad with Black Dawah Network on Facebook. Until next time, brothers and sisters, take care of yourselves. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuhu.